Hello. I wish you doing well. He is a British journalist and novelist. His work was notorious for clarity, intelligence, wit, and warning against the absence of social justice, opposition to totalitarian rule, and his belief in democratic socialism. The 20th century is considered the best centuries of English culture. Orwell's books on literary criticism, fictional poetry, and dialectical journalism. The most known work is his dystopian work, the novel in 1984 that he wrote in 1949 AD, and his allegorical novel The Animal Farm in 1945 AD. And Monday their copies were sold together more than any other book of the 20th century. His book Greetings to Catalonia in 1938 was part of his experience in the Spanish Civil War, and is widely recognized as his great essay on politics, literature, language and culture. In 2008, The Times put it second on the list of the 50 greatest British writers since 1945. The influence of Orwell's work on the prevailing political culture, an Orwellian term describing the practices of authoritarian and totalitarian rule that entered into popular culture like many other words of his innovation continued like Big Brother, dual thinking, Cold War, thought crime, and thought police. Orwell suffered from tuberculosis early, 7, and died in 1950, at which time he was only 46 years old. Eric Arthur Blair was born on June 25, 1903, in Motihari, in the Indian state of Bihar, for a middle-class family. Eric's great-grandfather, Charles Blair, was a rich statesman in Dorset who married Mrs. Mary Van, daughter of Thomas Van Earl of Westmoreland 8, who was wealthy because of his farmland in Jamaica. As for his grandfather, Thomas Richard Arthur Blair, he was a clergyman. And although the gift passed through generations, the wealth did not happen. Eric Blair described his family as higher than the middle class dash. His father, Richard Wilmsry Blair, was a junior civil servant in the British civil administration in India in the Opium Department, and his mother, Ida Maid Blair, who grew up in Mulmine, Burma, was the daughter of a simple French timber merchant in Burma. Eric had two sisters, Marjorie, 5 years older than him, and Avril, 5 years younger than him. When Eric was 1 year old, his mother took him and his sister to England. Eric was raised in the company of his mother and sisters, and separated from them for a short period in the summer of 1907. And they did not see their father Richard until 1912. In his mother's diary, which I wrote in 1905, she described the lively environment full of social activities and artistic interests. The family moved to Shidlik before the First World War, where Eric became a friend of the Puddicombe family, especially their daughter, Jacintha. When they first met, he was standing upside down on his head in the field, and when asked why, he said, "You can notice more things when you stand upside down than you do if you were standing normally." Eric and Jacintha were reading and writing poetry and dreaming of becoming famous writers, and he said that he might write a book in the same way as H.G. Wells in his book, Modern Utopia. During this time he was also enjoying shooting, fishing and bird-watching with Jacintha's brothers and sisters. When he was 5, Eric was sent as a morning student to the convent school in Henley, on the Thames, to which she, Marjorie, joined. The Church of the Roman Catholic monks was administered by the French Sisters of Ursuline, who were exiled from France after the religious education ban in 1903. His mother wanted him to collect studies in public schools, but his family was unable to provide the costs of the school, and he needed to obtain a scholarship. Ida Blair's brother, Charles Limousin, recommended Santa Cyprus School, an Eastbourne, East Sussex. Limousin, a skilled golf player, was known to the headmaster of the Royal Golf Club, Estebon, where he won several competitions in 1903 and 1904. The principal helped Eric to win a scholarship, and made special arrangements to allow Eric's parents to pay half of the usual fees. In September 1911 Eric arrived at St. Cyprus School. Eric studied at the school for the next 5 years, and was returning home only on school holidays. He did not know anything about the reduced tuition fees, even though he knew by his self-observation that he was coming from a poor house. Blair disliked school, and wrote in later years the article This and That Place of Joy, which was published after his death, depending on his time at school. At St. Cyprus School, Braille first met Cyril Colony, who later became a famous writer and editor-in-chief. Horizon. As part of his work, Blair wrote 2 poems that were published in the local newspaper and came second after Colony at the Higher History Prize, and praised his work as an external school inspector, and was awarded a scholarship at the Wellington and Eton colleges. But the Eton College scholarship did not guarantee him a place, and it was not immediately available, so he chose to stay in St. Cyprus School until 1916 in the event that Eton College becomes available to him. In January, when he was 13, he received a scholarship to study in Wellington, where he spent the spring period. In May 1917 there was a place available at the Eton College in the King's Chair. He studied at Eton College until December 1921, when he left school at the age of 18 and a half. Wellington is repugnant, which is what childhood friend Joseph Badcombe told him, but he said there was an interesting and happy in Eton. His main teacher was Asaph Joe, a graduate of the Holy Trinity University in Cambridge, and he was also the one who later advised him on his job. Blair studied French very briefly by Aldous Huxley and Stephen Ronsman, who was at Eton College with Blair, and indicated that he and contemporary students were appreciative of his, Huxley, linguistic talent. Cyril Connolly, Blair followed to Eton, but because they had studied in different years they did not relate to each other. Blair's academic performance reports indicated that he neglected his academic studies. But during his time in Eton he worked with Roger Minnows to produce the college magazine. In the Times elections he joined in producing other publications such as University Days, Bubbles and Slave, and participated in the Eton Wall game, which is football like or rugby. His parents could not bear the burden of sending him to another university without receiving a new scholarship, and they concluded through his bad school reports that he would not be able to get one. Ronsman indicated that he had a romantic idea of the East, and his family decided that Peller had to join the Indian Police Corps, and decided to travel in 1922 to work for the Indian Imperial Police. For this reason he had to pass the entrance examination. His father retired in Southwold, which is called Suffolk in our contemporary time. Blair enrolled in a directed school called Craighurst, and developed a classical understanding of English and history. Blair passed the test and finished 7th out of the 26 candidates with a score of success. In April 1926 he moved to Mulmine, where his grandmother lived from his mother. At the end of that year he was transferred to Katha in Upper Burma, where he developed dengue fever in 1927. He was entitled to a leave in England that year and could return in July due to the conditions of his illness. In September 1927, while staying with his family on vacation in England and Cornell, he re-evaluated his life, decided not to return to Burma, and resigned from his position in the Imperial Indian Police Corps to become a writer. He took advantage of his experiences in Burma Police to write the novel Burmese Days, 1934, in which he examined his experiences during the colonial period in Burma, and the article Hanga, 1931, and Shoot an Elephant, 1936. In Burma, Orwell acquired a reputation as a foreign individual, and spent most of his time alone reading or pursuing activities that were not consistently, such as attending a church, and also with the Karen ethnic group. His colleague Roger Bidon stated in the BBC's 1969 recording that Orwell was quick to learn the language, and this was before he left Burma, where he was able to speak smoothly with Burmese priests with a very high level of eloquence depending on the Burmese dialect. He wrote Orwell explains his feelings of guilt and guilt over his role in working for the empire, and he began looking closer to his country and found that it was also oppressed. Orwell changed his appearance in Burma, which he would stay with throughout his life. While in Burma he raised a mustache similar carrying the British police stationed there, and he tattooed every joint his hands. The knuckle had a small, indecent blue circle. Most Burmese live in rural areas, and still have fun with a tattoo similar to this. They believe that it is for protection from bullets and snake bites. After returning to settle in the family home in Southwold, England, he renewed his acquaintance with local friends and attended the ancient Etonian dinner. He also visited his old Jao teacher in Cambridge to take advice on becoming a writer. Early in the fall of 1927 he returned to London. Ruth Peter helped him find a furnished apartment, which he as a family acquaintance and by the end of 1927 he moved to live in a room on Portobello Street. The Blue Plate, a plaque placed to connect the famous to certain places, is the orphan memory of his presence there. Peter is involved in this step. I will give him enough respect for Mrs. Peeler. Peter had an eager interest in Pilar's writings, noting him of weaknesses in his poetry and poems, and advising him to write about what he knew. In fact, he decided to write about the confirmed aspects of the present that he plans to know, and adventures on the eastern end of London, the first appropriate story he would like to write to reveal to himself a world of poverty and what is below it and what is outside of the world in which he resides. Article and topic. Those stories, explorations, expeditions, tours and adventures that took place sporadically over a 5-year period. In his simulations of Jack London, who admired his writings, especially The People of Hell, Orwell began discovering through so-called sluming tourism in slums, in the slums of London. On his first outing he set out on the Temple Bridge in the Limehouse area, and spent his first night in a shared dormitory and perhaps in a bed on which he would pay tax. For a while, My Country in his country became dressed like the homeless, while offering concessions to the middle class and the norms and expectations that it represented, and he recorded his experience in the humble life to use it in The Nail, which is his first article published in the English language, and in the second half of his first book, Fall and Exit from Paris and London. In the spring of 1928, he left for Paris, which was tempting for aspiring writers in terms of living prices and their bohemian life. He lived in Rio de Pot de Vire, the 5th district in a working-class neighborhood. His Aunt Nellie Limousine, who also lives in Paris, was financially and socially supportive of him. He used to write novels and included a first copy of the Burmese Days, but nothing continued during this period. He was more successful as a journalist and published an article in Mund, a political/literary magazine edited by Henry Barbas. His first article as a professional writer entitled Censorship in England, which was published on October 6, 1928-GK Weekly Publishing, where he was the first article to be published in England. And a newspaper was published on December 20, 1928. It offers the civil foundations founded by the left-wing cartel party. 3 articles that appeared in the Progress of the Civil were discussing unemployment and a day in the life of a London vagrant and beggars respectively. In one way or another, the topic of poverty was the one he wrote about, always and wherever he was obsessively, until the advent of his book, The Nostalgia for Catalonia. He fell ill in February 1929 and was taken to Cochin Hospital in the 14th region, which is a free hospital where medical students train. His experience there was the reference to his article, How the Poor Die, published in 1964. Although he decided not to mention the hospital's name, he also deliberately misled about its location. Shortly after, he stole all his money from his home. This prompted him out of necessity or simply to collect information to work in multiple jobs such as dishwashing at a hotel and duty rivalry, which he later described in his article The Entrances and Exits of Paris and London, whose owner was John Middleton Mary, who took over as editor-in-chief for Max Blemin and Sir Richard Rees, and was approved by Plowman for publication. In April 1932, Blair became a teacher at Hawthorne High School, a preparatory school for boys in Hayes, West London. It was a small private school to teach the children of local merchants and shop owners and had 20 students and another teacher. While in school, he became friendly with the priest from the local parish church and became involved in activities there. Maple Fears followed up with more, and at the end of June 1932 she told Moore Blair that Victor Gulanx was ready to publish the Scullion's Diary for £40, through his newly established Victor Clean's Limited Publishing Organization, Victor, which was an outlet for radical, essential, and social works. At the end of the summer semester in 1932, Blair returned to South and Wold, where his parents used their legacy to buy their own home. Blair and his sister Avril tried on summer vacation days to make the house habitable, while he was also working on Burmese Days. He was spending time with Jack Eleanor, but her association with Dennis Collins remained an obstacle to his hopes for a serious relationship. Clink is the name of the article describing his failed attempt to send her to prison and published in the August 1932 issue in Adelphi. He returned to teaching in Hayes and is preparing his book for publication, now known as Falling and Exiting in Paris and London. he expressed his desire to publish it in a different name, to avoid any embarrassment to his family, to spend his time in the novel as a bum. In a letter to Moore, dated November 15, 1932, he left the choice of the nickname for Gulanks. 4 days later, he wrote to Moore, some nicknames including Burton, name used when hanging around, Miles Kenneth, George Orwell, and Louis Alois. I finally rely on the nickname George Orwell, as Jack Eleanor said, which is a good dynamic English name. Fall and Exit in Paris and London was published on January 9, 1933, as Orwell continued work on The Days of Burma. In New York in the summer of 1933 he left Blair Hawthorne's to become a teacher at Friars College, Uxbridge, West London. The college established had 200 students and a whole group of employees. He got on a motorbike and wandered through the surrounding countryside. And in one of these tours he had pneumonia. He was taken to Uxbridge Hospital, where he believed for a time that his life was in danger. When he was discharged from hospital in January 1934, he returned to South and recovered with the support of his parents. And he did not return to teaching after that. He was disappointed when he refused Gulanks, Burma's Days, for reasons related to possible claims of defamation, but Harper's was ready to publish it in the United States. It was during this period that Blair began working on the novel The Clergyman's Daughter, referring to his life as a teacher and his life in Southwold. It was during this time that Eleanor Jack got married and went to Singapore and Brenda Sickle left for Ireland, so Blair was alone in Southwold working, walking alone and spending time with his father. Eventually in October, after sending A Cleric's Daughter to Moore, he left for London to work where his Aunt Nellie Limousine found him a job. Orwell was appointed to Spain on December 23, 1936, and had dinner with Henry Miller in Paris on his way to Spain. A few days later, Orwell met a member of the Independent Workers' Party, John McNair, in his office in Barcelona, who cited, "I came here to fight fascism." Orwell was in a hot political spot in Catalonia. The Republican government is backed by a number of fascists with conflicting goals, including the United Marxist Workers' Party and its acronym in Spanish, POM, the Anarchist Union, and the Socialist Union of Catalonia, a wing of the Spanish Communist Party, backed by weapons and Soviet aid. The Independent Workers' Party was associated with the United Marxist Workers' Party, which Orwell joined later. After a time at the Lenin barracks in Barcelona, Orwell was sent to the relatively quiet front of the Argonne under the auspices of George Cope. By January 1937, he was in the bridge at an altitude of 1,500 feet (460 meters) above the water's surface and in the harshness of winter. There was negligible military action, and with no equipment and some essentials the situation became uncomfortable. Orwell quickly became familiar with his military experience and receiving police training. With the British Independent Workers' Party arriving 3 weeks later, Orwell and another army man named Williams were sent with them to Monte Oscuro. This newly arrived unit included Bob Smiley, Bob Edwards, Stafford Cutman and Jack Branthwaite. Then the unit was sent to Flat. Meanwhile in England, Ellen was dealing with everything related to the publication of her husband's book The Way to Wagon Bear, before she went to Spain to follow her husband and left behind her aunt, Nellie Limousine, to take care of the shops. Eileen volunteered for a while at McNair's John office, and with the help of Cobb George, she was able to visit her husband and send some English tea, chocolate, and cigars to him. Orwell spent days in the hospital poisoning his hand, and most of his property was stolen in the meantime by hospital staff. He returned to the front to witness a movement in a night attack on the national trenches, in which an enemy soldier pursued a bayonet rifle and killed him in his place. In April, Orwell returned to Barcelona. Orwell contacted a communist friend with whom he had a relationship with Spanish medical assistance, where he explained to him his situation and expressed his desire to send to the Madrid front and join the International Brigade. Although he did not think much of the communists, he could still regard them as friends and allies. This is about to end. It was May days in Barcelona where Orwell was caught up in internal fighting. He spent most of his time on the roof with a pile of novels, but faced John Kimchi from the days of his stay in Hampstead. Later, a campaign of lies and misinformation by the communist press, in which the United Marxist Workers' Party (POM) was accused of collaborating with the fascists, began, and this affected Orwell. Instead of joining the International Brigade as he had intended, Orwell decided to return to the Aragon front. As soon as the confrontations of the May Days ended, a communist friend approached him, asking him whether he was still interested in joining the International Brigade, and Orwell was surprised by their desire to annex him after the communist newspapers dealt with charges against Orwell with fascism. Whoever was in Barcelona will not forget its time, or even the months that followed, that freaky atmosphere filled with fear, suspicion and hatred, newspaper censorship, overcrowded prisons, long lines of food, and gangs of armed men roaming the streets. After Orwell was returned to the front, he was injured in his throat by a sniper bullet. Orwell was relatively taller than the Spanish warriors, 58, and he was warned not to stand against the ditch barrier. Orwell could not speak with profuse bleeding from his mouth. Orwell was taken on a carrier to Sutamo in an ambulance, and after a bumpy ride through Barbastro, Orwell arrived at the hospital in Lleida chafy enough to be sent to Tarragona on May 27, 1937. 2 days later, the PSU sanatorium was dispatched on the outskirts of Barcelona. The bullet barely missed its main artery to leave it with an almost audible sound. He was electrified and medically fit to return to service. By mid-June, the worsening political situation in Barcelona, the United Marxist Workers' Party was outlawed and under attack as a Trotskyist organization as described by pro-Soviet communists. The Communist Party believes that the United Marxist Workers' Party was objectively fascist, which impedes the Republican issue. Then an obnoxious poster appeared, showing a head wearing the mask of the United Marxist Workers' Party removed from it to show the swastika beneath. Members, including a cop, who had been arrested while others had gone into hiding. Orwell and his wife were under threat, so they tried to stay out of sight despite their risk of uncovering their cover when they tried to help Cobb. Finally, Orwell and his wife escaped by train from Spain to Banyuls-sur-Mer for a short stay before returning to England. In the first week of July 1937, Orwell arrived back at Wallington. On July 13, 1973, Orwell was sued in court in Valencia for espionage and high treason, accusing Orwell's family with Trotskyists of being agents of the United Marxist Workers' Party. The leaders of the Marxist Workers' Party and Orwell were tried in absentia in Barcelona in October and November 1938. Observing events in French Morocco, Orwell wrote that they were merely a byproduct of Russian Trotskyist experiences, and that from the beginning they were full of lies and scandalous absurdities that circulated and published by the communist press. The Recreation Experience for the Spanish Civil War later presented his book A Tribute to Catalonia. He spent most of his career writing articles and columns in newspapers and magazines, and writing his book publications such as his book Down to Paris and Out of London, describing a state of poverty in these cities, The Road to Wigan Pier, describing the living conditions of the poor in northern England and the living gap, in addition to his book, Honor Catalonia. According to Irving Howe, Orwell was the best English writer after Hazel, and perhaps after Johnson. Most readers believe today that Orwell is a novelist, especially after the success of Animal Farm and 1984. The first explains the decline of the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution and the rise of Stalinism, and the second talks about life under totalitarian rule. This novel is often compared to the brave novel The New World by its author, Aldous Huxley. Both narratives are similar in terms of a state that exercises its power and full control over social life. Orwell's novel, 1984, won the Prometheus Prize for Literature as well as Fahrenheit 451 for Ray Ryder. The same thing happened, but with the Animal Farm novel in 2011. Among the extracts from the autobiography that Orwell had sent to newspaper editors in 1940, he wrote, "Most of the readers of them without boredom are Shakespeare, Swift, Fielding, Dickens, Charles Rudd and Flaubert. Among the modern-day writers James Joyce, Eliot and Lawrence, but remained Somerset Maugham is one of the most influenced writers in the modern era because of its distinct ability to tell stories directly without any linguistic cost." On another topic, Orwell strongly indicated the work of Jack London, in particular his book The Road The novel reveals how poverty makes the lives of people in the abyss, represented by an American who denies the seas in order to explore poverty in the streets of London. In an essay by Orwell he wrote in 1946 entitled Politics versus Literature, a study of Galvier's travels, he wrote the following: "If I were to keep one of the books that I got rid of, then the book of Jailfer's travels would be among them." Orwell's health continued to deteriorate after he was diagnosed with tuberculosis in December 1947. In the summer of 1949, and after flirtatious attempts by Orwell to attract Sonia Brownwell, he ended up announcing a summer marriage in September of the same year, shortly before he went to the University Hospital in London. This has caused anxiety for his old friends Magridge. At the time of the announcement of the marriage, Ariel Harson sent an accountant to the hospital where Orwell lay, and was invited to become the director of GOP Limited, but unfortunately there was no independent witness. The interesting thing is that Orwell held his wedding party in room 13 of the hospital on October 13, 1949 in the presence of David and Astor as a boy. 84. While Orwell's health was getting worse and worse, he was visited by a good group of acquaintances such as Magridge Connolly, Freud Lucian, Spendler Stephen, Evelyn Washington, Potts Paul Anthony Paul and his teacher counterpart Eaton Zhao. During those visits, ideas and plans were presented to go to the Alps in Switzerland, and meetings were also held with his accountant at the same time that Mr. Harson and Mrs. Blair were announced as company directors, and it was confirmed by Harson that the terms of the agreement were implemented properly and that copyright for their company. By Christmas, Orwell's health began to deteriorate again. On the evening of January 20, 1950, Potts Orwell visited him, but he retreated when he found him falling asleep. However, a visit to him was scheduled at another time by Jack Harson, who claimed that Orwell had provided him with a 25% stake in the company. On the morning of January 21st, an artery that connects Orwell's lungs caused his death at the age of 46. Orwell recommended that he be buried according to the traditions of the Evangelical Church in his nearest church in the place where he dies, laid to be in the vicinity of London. David Astor, an acquaintance of Orwell who had previously lived in the village of Sitton Courtenay of the Oxfordshire state, negotiated with a lawmaker for Orwell's burial in the cemetery of the Saints even though he had no connection with the village. This epitaph wrote on Arrow's tombstone, "Here Arthur Blair lies, born on July 25, 1903 and died on January 21, 1950, and there is no indication of his other name." Orwell's son, Richard Blair, was brought up by one of the women after his father's death. Although his father's history is receiving attention, he did not get that popularity and appearance. Blair worked as an agricultural agent for the British government. In 1979, Sonia, Orwell's widow, filed a lawsuit in the Supreme Court against Harrison, who transferred 75% of the company's shares in his favor, causing the company to lose its financial value and waste its assets. Although she had all the evidence against Harrison, the illness was unimaginable, and eventually she and Harrison made a material settlement out of court. Sonia died at the age of 62 on December 11, 1980. We done now. Thanks for watching. Goodbye my friends.